Stalin, Chapter 1. How to Cast a God into Hell. The Khrushchev Report. Section. A huge, grim, whimsical, morbid human monster. If today we analyze on the cult of personality and its consequences, read by Khrushchev at a closed-door session during the Congress of the CPSU, and later hailed as the Secret Report, one detail immediately draws our attention. What's before us is a condemnatory speech that intends to liquidate Stalin in all his aspects. The man guilty of so many horrendous crimes was an individual worthy of contempt, both at the moral and intellectual level. Aside from being ruthless, the dictator was also an absurd figure. He learned about the country and the agricultural situation, quote, only through movies. Films that, moreover, embellished reality to the point of making it unrecognizable. Instead of being driven by political logic or realpolitik, the bloody repression unleashed by him was dictated by his capriciousness and his pathological lust for power, libido dominandi. Thus emerged, Deutscher observes with satisfaction in June of 1956, astonished by Khrushchev's revelations, and having forgotten the respectful and at times admiring portrait of Stalin he himself made 3 years earlier, the depiction of, quote, the huge, grim, whimsical, morbid human monster, end quote. The despot so lacked moral qualms that he was suspected of having plotted the assassination of the man who appeared to be his best friend, Kirov, in order to denounce and liquidate his real, potential, or imaginary opponents one after another for that crime. The merciless repression didn't only fall upon individuals or political figures. Instead, it would include, quote, the mass deportations of entire peoples, arbitrarily accused and collectively condemned for connivance with the enemy. But at least Stalin had contributed to saving his country and the world from the horrors of the Third Reich. On the contrary, Khrushchev insisted, the Great Patriotic War was won despite the dictator's madness. It was only because of his short-sightedness, his stubbornness, the blind trust he placed in Hitler, that the Third Reich's troops had initially managed to enter deep into Soviet territory, causing death and destruction on a massive scale. Yes, it's Stalin's fault that the Soviet Union had been unprepared and poorly defended for the tragic encounter. Quote, we had only started to modernize our military equipment on the eve of war. At the start of the war, we didn't even have a sufficient number of rifles to arm all the soldiers called up. End quote. As if that wasn't more than enough, quote, after the first defeats and first disasters on the front lines, the man responsible for all this had given into despair and even apathy. End quote. Overtaken by a sense of defeat, quote, we have forever lost all that Lenin had created. And unable to react, quote, Stalin refrained from overseeing military operations and stopped dealing with anything. End quote. It's true that after some time had passed, and finally ceding to pressure from other members of the Politburo, he returned to his post. If only he hadn't. At the time when it faced a mortal threat, the man who had despotically ruled the Soviet Union had been such an incompetent dictator that he didn't have, quote, any familiarity with the conduct of military operations. End quote. It's a charge that the Secret Report firmly insists on. Quote, we should note that Stalin planned operations on a globe. Yes, comrades, he used to take a globe and trace the front line on it. End quote. Despite everything, the war had ended favorably, but still the bloody paranoia grew worse. Now the Secret Report's portrait of the morbid human monster, according to Deutscher's observations, can be considered complete. Only 3 years had passed since the demonstrations of grief provoked by Stalin's death, and his popularity was still so solid that, at least in the USSR, the campaign launched by Khrushchev was initially met by, quote, strong resistance. Beginning of long quote. On March 5, 1956, students in Tbilisi took to the streets to place flowers at the monument to Stalin on the occasion of the 3rd anniversary of his death, and that gesture in honor of Stalin turned into a protest against the deliberations of the 20th Congress. The demonstrations and assemblies continued for 5 days, until the afternoon of March 9th, when tanks were sent into the city to restore order. End quote. That possibly explains the characteristics of the texts we are examining. In the USSR and in the socialist camp, a hard political struggle was taking place, and the absurd depiction of Stalin would ideally serve to delegitimize the, quote, Stalinists, who could overshadow the new leadership. The, quote, cult of personality that had reigned until that moment didn't allow for nuanced judgments. It was necessary to cast a god into hell. Some decades earlier, during another political battle with different characteristics, but no less tough, Trotsky had also painted a picture of Stalin that sought not only to condemn him at the political and moral level, but also ridicule him at a personal level. He had been a, quote, small provincial man, an individual characterized from the very beginning by an irredeemable mediocrity and pettiness, which he regularly demonstrated in the political, military, and ideological fields, who was never able to overcome, quote, his peasant rudeness. End quote. Certainly, in 1913, he had published a work of undeniable theoretical value, Marxism and the National Question. But the true author was Lenin, and the man whose signature is on the text should be considered a usurper of the great revolutionary's, quote, intellectual rights. There was no lack of similarities between the two depictions. Khrushchev insinuated that the real instigator of Kirov's assassination had been Stalin, and Stalin had been accused, or at least suspected, by Trotsky of having hastened Lenin's death with his, quote, Mongolian ferocity. The secret report denounced Stalin for the cowardly neglect of his responsibilities at the start of Hitler's invasion, but already on September 2, 1939, while anticipating Operation Barbarossa, Trotsky wrote that, quote, the new aristocracy, in power in Moscow, was characterized, among other things, for, quote, its inability to conduct a war. The, quote, ruling caste in the Soviet Union was destined to assume the attitude, quote, proper to all regimes destined to die. After us, the deluge. End quote. With great similarities between them, to what point do these two depictions withstand historical examination? It's worthwhile to begin analyzing the secret report which, made official by a CPSU party congress and by the party's top leadership, immediately imposed itself as a revelation of a long-suppressed but now incontestable truth. End of section.